welcome you to today's Page Patrons webinar, which we've titled Gaining the Early Warning Risk Advantage through CommTech. For those of you who don't know, a Page Patron is a leading solution provider that, in exchange for a sponsorship of Page, works with us to educate members about how solutions and services like theirs can help enable leading-edge communications capabilities. Today's webinar is made possible with support from CRISP, which provides 24/7 early warning risk intelligence for brands, enterprises, and for social platforms as well. Today's discussion will feature Page member Katie Ioanilli, who's the CCO at Ralph Lauren, Page member Adam Hildreth, who's the CEO and founder of CRISP, and Dr. Andrea Bonime-Blanc, who's a leading global governance, risk, ESG, ethics, cyber, and crisis strategist. That's a mouthful. Together, we'll explore how you can harness CommTech to gain an early warning advantage over potential issues that are emerging online, and how you can use this intelligence to inform your communication strategies. With that, it's time to get to our discussion. Katie, Andrea, and Adam, I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to start, actually, if each of you can just say hello. I think you can see everybody on the screen. I don't know if everybody can see all three of you at once. I want to start with the question for all three of you. It seems like we've moved from preparing for distinct kind of scenarios and crisis situations to this perpetual state of issues management, from the pandemic to societal justice to economic challenges. The list goes on and on. I'm wondering if you can share how you think about assessing risk across so many dimensions as we are today, and how you do that at the real-time speed that's necessary today. Katie, let's start with you if we can.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here and see some familiar faces. And thank you, Elliot, for inviting me to this discussion. I think that you're right. It sort of feels like we're in a pressure cooker, especially the last 9-10 months or so. I think that, just to sort of zoom out for a moment, I often talk to my team about what we do in terms of perception and reality. And so our job is not to spin. Our job is not just to execute communications, but our job is to really understand the reality of what's happening inside our business and understand what our different audiences, stakeholders, what their perception of that reality is, and figure out where those gaps are and figure out how to bridge those gaps, right? We're always striving to make sure that those two things, perception and reality, are in sync. And I think especially in the last 9 months or so plus, I've lost track of how long this has all been. That perception is all those conversations, all those feelings, all that heightened emotion is happening online. It has been for a while now, but that has got to be part of the calculus of how you assess risk. So, for us, we're a consumer products brand. We have a lot to say about things like dreams and aspiration. And that wasn't necessarily appropriate when people were concerned with their health and their families and their own well-being. And so having the ability to actually assess how people are feeling with a tool like CRISP is a really, really important, like I said, part of the calculus when we're thinking about what we're going to say, how we're going to say it. And for us, I think, again, especially in the context of COVID, the acceleration of Black Lives Matter, et cetera, understanding those perceptions and reflecting them back into the company, not only to inform communication strategies, but business decisions and strategies. And I think that has been, that has always sort of been what we strive to do. And I think part of the really important, the highest priority of this function. But I think that has become increasingly valuable in the last 9+ months.
Let me just turn to you, Andrea, to build on that. What are your thoughts here, just in terms of the speed of the threats that are out there and how companies are thinking about preparedness?
Sure thing. Well, thank you so much for having me as well. It's a great company to be with, talking about really important things. And what I'm seeing, and I'll give you a little background in terms of where I come from, because I think it informs a little bit of what I share with people when I talk about these things and do this kind of work, which is my background was I spent about 20 years as a senior executive in 4 different companies: general counsel, chief ethics and compliance officer, risk officer, and supervising a variety of different functions, including working very closely with communications executives, even supervising them in one of the companies. And one of the big lessons learned that I had from those days, and now for the last few years, I've had my own business doing this from the outside looking in, is that we need to collaborate and break the silos. And it can't just happen when the crisis happens. It has to be something that we're prepared for and doing at all times. And so this continuous preparation for the crisis that will undoubtedly come, and the mega crisis or the perfect storm of crises that we have right now really brings that to the fore in a way that we've never seen before. And my humble opinion is that we're going to continue to have a variety of crises that are going to be present with us, whether pandemic related, social justice, diversity, inclusion related, social media related, you name it. And so I think it's really important for teams inside companies to have those transversal groups of people that are collaborating with each other, who have different perspective, different eyes on an issue, who are able to, in a really complex world that we live in, where everything is interconnected. I work a lot in the ESG space, so environmental social governance. I've added a T in a book that I recently wrote for technology, because I think all of these kinds of issues are interconnected and affect each other. And so by the same token, if you're inside a company and you're a CCO or a chief risk officer or a general counsel or someone else, you need to be working with those other people to see the full view of the issue that you're dealing with. And I sit on the board of advisors of CRISP, and I think that this is, again, a very important piece of the puzzle to have that kind of early warning information, issue spotting, which can become a risk, which can become a crisis. So we have to equip ourselves within our organizations, not only with the transversal interdisciplinary kind of collaboration, but also having the tools, the insights, the information that you need, so that when the time comes, you're ready. And my whole sort of, larger scale sort of rationale for this is, if you do it, you will be resilient during the crisis, and you will come out on the other end much better than some of the other companies that are not prepared. So it builds resilience and value over time. So I'll leave it at that. I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to talk about these things.
Thank you, Andrea.
Sure.
Adam, your thoughts?
So I think my starting point is how it's evolved over the last couple of years, and how sort of enterprises and brands looked at it. I mean, everyone will be aware of social media listening tools, and they still do a brilliant job of sort of looking back in time and finding the issues that you already know about or you want to find out about. And typically keyword related, lots of different searches. So they still have their space. But the area we've been really involved in at CRISP is really twofold. One is we've seen what we refer to, quite a techie term, but unknown unknowns. Things just rising from nowhere, but becoming huge in hours, generally speaking, that we had no idea about. And how you go and understand what that thing is and who that could impact is really critical for the brands that we work with. So that having that understanding of the brand, but also we call them, when we refer to people rather than the content. So often what we find is these new issues arising, which we refer to as unknown unknowns. We want to focus on who instigated it. Where did it come from? Are they important in the sense of, is it genuine media? Is it a bot network? Is it something else? But then most important, who are they influencing? And the people they influencing, how are they reacting to it? And that's really, when we look at early warning, we're trying to predict issues ahead of them being an issue, right? And I think a lot of times it's the forewarned is forearmed. And I think that's where the industry is going. Things change at such a rate of knots. We've got these unknown unknowns that no one could have predicted. The pandemic's a great example of that, albeit it's a stretched example when it comes to other issues. Generally issues and crises for brands can be a lot smaller. And So that world's changing. We talk about early warning, having an understanding. And by the way, you don't want an early warning for everything. If you're sifting through absolutely everything, then you need a vendor to go and do that. But understanding unknown unknowns that are originating, understand who instigated it, who are they influencing, and between that triangle of things, what it is, who instigated, who influenced it, which brands does that affect, under what level, and going back to one of your points, and I think that is changing that crisis plan from that typical workflow of, if this happens, this is what we'll do, this is how we'll capture it, we'll do a report on Monday, to being very dynamic as well. And when I talk about dynamic, we're seeing things happen on a daily basis that we were never going to predict, sooner. So actually being on the phone and being live with a customer and a client and a partner, so that they can tell us whether this is going to pose a problem or not. So I think that's where the market's moving really fast in terms of where it was and where it's going.
Yeah, Katie, if I can turn to you here. When we were having our pre-conversation for this call, you mentioned that you're not a big fan of the huge crisis binder with, if this happens, contact all these people. Part of that, I think, is just a product of how the risk environment has changed. And to Adam's point, how diverse the threats can be. How are you thinking about reputation risk and the ways that Ralph Lauren has not only early detection, but musters a really quick and effective response when needed?
Sure. And I'm not a big fan of huge crisis playbooks. I probably learned that from Steve Lippin early on. I think that it's very rare that you are in the heat of the moment and you refer to scenario 47 and it actually feels right. I think the exception for me in my years of working experience is probably around a cyber threat. I have actually found those sorts of playbooks to be quite useful. But aside from that, I think the most important thing, and Adam sort of gets to this, and Andrea as well, is understanding, having a sense and a feel for what is percolating and what is emerging. Being able to have this sort of insight analysis and technology that enables that, but then layering on that human judgment, and to Andrea's point, the importance of having kind of cross-functional line of sight into those things is really important. So I don't know if this precisely answers your question, Elliot, but one of the things that we've worked really hard to establish at Ralph Lauren is, our early warning system is not an early warning system for our communications function. Our early warning system is an early warning system for the organization. And we've created a process whereby, in this, really credit goes to my team on this, we have provided Chris with a sense of the issues that we care about and that we want to monitor. And they have been introduced and have, email distribution lists, just to get really tactical for a moment, of the people who should be made aware if there is a security issue in our store, if there is a customer service issue, and actually not having us be the intermediary. Certainly if it's, if it is communications related, if we do need to advise on strategy, if it's particularly thorny, we will absolutely get involved. But if it's sort of a customer complaining that they had a poor store experience or were treated unfairly in some way, HR intervenes on the basis of that alert that goes to them. And so that has been a really, really useful process for us in this environment where all the conversations are happening online, and it is so, to use Adam's word, it is so dynamic. And then when it comes to like a real true crisis, firstly, I will say, I think that sometimes a big part of my job, and I'm sure all of yours, is to say, this is actually not a crisis. And the data and the insights and the way in which conversations are trending, having an ability to actually point to that when something feels quite personal or, really aggravates colleagues internally, being able to point to those data and insights to back up what is it's not actually a crisis is really important. But when there is an actual crisis or something that is emerging as a crisis, being able to be very clear on the team that is getting together to make the decisions on what to do, what to execute is absolutely critical. And also, again, on Andrea, to your point, thinking about all of the different, it's sort of trite to say this in 2020, but you cannot really distinguish among stakeholders anymore. Meaning, it's not like the investor audience sees one particular message and not everything else that you're doing and saying online. And so making sure that we're connecting into all of the other stakeholders in our business, such that if there's something that's brewing that could be highly sensitive or offensive, we're not putting out an image on social media that is going to incite a conversation and create a forum to discuss this issue over here.
Yeah, Katie, I really hear your point, especially just around the judgment that's needed, that the data is helpful, but ultimately you need to make some educated guesses about how likely this is to create a bigger issue. Adam, one of the things that we hear from CRISP is that, it's not just the technology. There's impressive AI and natural language processing that can do a lot of the heavy lifting because of the scale and speed, but that there's still a really critical human component. Can you talk more about why that's important and what that looks like in terms of the service that you provide?
Yeah, sure. So, the best example I can probably give for this is that I'll come back to that unknown again. So let's say I always use 3 a.m. in the morning. Stuff always happens at 3 a.m. But we start to see a new trend happening between a specific group of people. There is no way AI can see a trend, but it has no idea about what it really relates to and then who would care about that or who it could impact. It's very good at spotting the level of conversation around that trend and who's talking about it, coming back to that people element. But it cannot really distinguish between something that's going to impact one of the brands we partner with or something that isn't at all and it's nothing to worry about. And so that's one thing, is understanding these new unknown unknowns. And once you do know about them, yes, they can be tracked over time, and everyone's very familiar with tools that exist to track known topics, apart from making sure that if there is a tick up in conversation or a decrease in sentiment, and again, understanding the impact to the brand, you've got to have a human team that, one, can scale to do that, but two, that understands the brand as well as the brand themselves. Now that takes a bit of time to get, but that, AI is not taking over the planet just yet. It doesn't have that human judgment, but it does have speed and scalability. So we absolutely believe in marrying the two together. And another great example of this is sometimes we are forewarned by one of the brands we work with that they may have an impending issue that they're aware of. They don't know if it's anywhere yet, but if it is an issue to them, they need to pick up the phone and speak to someone 24/7. It can't wait until to log into the tool. And when you start looking at the levels of monitoring and signals that we don't expect our customers to log into a tool and configure something. That's the level that our analysts and our intelligence analysts do. So I think there's multiple factors that need that human element. But the main thing is bridging that gap between, is what's being detected as an anomaly or this new unknown relevant to any of the brands we work with, or do we think it is? And vice versa. Then when the brands say to us, right, thanks for telling us about it, but we're not too concerned at the moment, or the opposite to that is, thank you, yes, we are really concerned. We need to deep dive to understand where that's coming from. And Katie made a great point earlier about, we have this issue of just looking at mentions around a topic. There's a perception that, oh, this is a massive thing and it's going to really impact us. We are trying to get to the point, and we're not quite there yet when I talk about this instigator and influencers, really being focused around who the people are that are seeing this content, and does that matter? And sometimes it can be things that are hardly ever mentioned, but because of the groups that are mentioning them, activist or extremist group or other things, that can be the biggest issue ever, versus something that looks like it's trending and it could be really negative when we take it personally. So there's lots going on, and you can imagine all of that put together, you definitely need that human judgment going on there.
Yeah, Adam, it's such an interesting point. We have a question here from Daniel Tish. I want to get to that in a moment, but before I do, Andrea, if I can come to you, your vantage point, at least in part, is from a governance standpoint. There's obviously the risk environment has changed a lot. What's your view about what those changes have meant, and if this is the kind of thing that's on the typical board's radar, or what CCOs ought to be thinking about in terms of board engagement on risk evaluation?
Yeah, this is one of my pet areas for many years because I've been involved with governance for 20 plus years, both reporting into boards, being a corporate secretary to boards, and sitting on boards. And I think boards have been way, shall we say, unadvanced when it comes to these kinds of issues. And I think this year is the turning point. Typically, a board will have, very experienced, older, mostly men who are, CFOs or CEOs and very much financially minded. And unless a crisis happens to them, something that really imprints them, they really just go down their merry path of financial projections and revenues and profits and that sort of thing. But we live in a world where there's too much other kind of risk that affects the bottom line, and very much so the ESG and T issues, cyber being one of the T issues, AI ethics being another technology issue. And those kinds of issues can really affect not just the bottom line, but the reputation and the reputation risk piece that you mentioned earlier. And so boards have gotten smarter in the last year or so with all this conglomeration of things that are hitting at them, including doing business in a different way than they used to because they can't get together at the golf course anymore or whatever it is that they do. And also bringing in more diversity at the board level, which is a really, really important piece of the puzzle, not just women, people of color, geographically dispersed from parts of the business. And so if you have that kind of a board, you're going to have people asking those kinds of questions, the right kinds of questions. And the work of the CCO and of others that work hopefully with the CCO, like the chief risk officer or the general counsel and the business heads, they're going to be talking to each other more and then percolating these issues up to not only the C-suite, but the board. And the board more and more is asking questions about culture, about diversity, about climate change, if it's pertinent to their business. And clearly right now about all the reverberations of the social issues from the pandemic. And so there is change taking place. I think it's incumbent on the CCOs of the world to work closely with their peers within the organization to build up that sort of risk management, issue management, crisis management layers. Nothing bureaucratic, like Lauren said earlier. Katie said earlier, that you don't want to have the big fat books of crisis management and planning, but you do want to have real world scenario planning and exercises so people know who to contact. And it's a fluid, agile situation rather than one of those situations where, I have to look up who's up next. But you do want to have those cyber experts, for example, from the outside, ready on quick dial to get them in if there's a cyber incident, for example. That requires preparation and it requires people talking to each other and then also reporting up to the C-suite and the board.
I think if I could just chime in, Ellie, I think that's a really, really important point, Andrea. And for us, I think you mentioned board diversity, and there's certainly gender, a lot of work to be done on gender, a lot of work to be done on race and ethnicity when it comes to board, but also diversity of experience. And to your point, having people on the board who are not just thinking about risk in terms of business continuity, like straight business continuity, but actually considering reputational risk. And I think that is become, it's the last period that we've been living and working through have made it much more apparent that reputational risk has got to be higher on the priority when it comes to kind of risk register and all those types of things.
Well, and just to embellish your point, Katie, something like CRIS, for example, helps those people who are under the surface of the iceberg, of the reputation risk iceberg, helps those people, meaning yourself and others that are working together to sort of do the issue spotting, the early warning piece sooner rather than later, rather than being hit with it from a Wall Street Journal headline or what have you. And so I think the teams have to talk to each other, but they also have to be equipped with the tools and the insights that they need to be able to do their job well. Because my point, going back to reputation risk, my whole point about that is that if you are ready, you will not get hit as hard. Your stakeholders will not blame you as much. They will not, talk about you badly in social media. They won't abandon your products and services. And so if they see that that work is being done in the organization, they will respect that. And there will be trust and credibility when there could be lack of trust and abandonment, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I would like to go on record and say, I think that more CCOs should be on boards. And I'd like to see that trend take off.
Yeah. And I think
more important now.
It goes back to, is the person seasoned and equipped? Have they really understood the business or the business environment? Are they this Renaissance person? I think you need the Renaissance person, but they don't have to be a CEO or a CFO. In fact, many of those CEOs and CFOs are not Renaissance people. They're very much horses with blinders in terms of the financial piece, right?
Yeah. And for me, that goes back to how you define the role. What is the CCO in today's environment? And again, it's not about spin. It's not about communications execution alone. It's about really understanding how the mood of your audience is, how they're feeling, and understanding what's happening inside your business and figuring out how to bridge that. And bridging that sometimes doesn't mean communicating something. Sometimes it means influencing decision-making or action or strategy.
Yep.
So I've got a question here from Daniel Tish that I want to ask on his behalf. In about 10 minutes or so, I'll be opening up the conversation for questions from the audience. So please give that some thought if you'd like to jump in at that point. The question from Daniel is, there are various CommTech tools and platforms. To what extent can they be customized to distinct organizational needs? And have you adapted them or seen them adapted? Adam and Katie, I think maybe you're in the best position to answer this. Adam, Chris obviously features technology, but is also an advisory piece. Can you talk about how you see it fitting into a broader CommTech stack? And Katie, same question to you after Adam.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. I guess that what we've certainly at Chris, so all of our stack is built in-house. There's over 200 people that are part of sort of engineering and operations at Chris, plus 600 to 1,000 analysts on top, human analysts on top of that. But one of the critical things we've seen is we do what we call a risk consultation, which is, and it's not a paid for thing. It's not something we do. It's a demanded thing from customers. And that's to really understand what an organization is concerned with at the moment and could be. And we try and then develop industry-wide templates to get, so the more customers we have in a certain sector, the more that we've almost got the template predefined. And we're constantly adding to that. And that's really, really detailed. And what we map onto that is, as Kate said, who needs to know about if something like this happened, and then we go into subcategories on subcategories, who would need to know about it, what action needs to take, and what sort of priority do we get? And that model changes all the time. But our job at Chris is to use our humans to implement that model at scale. And I think as soon as you get to a really sophisticated backwards and forwards type model, you need analysts and engineers to make sure they can configure that platform. It's a specialist role there. And I think there's a fair number of people that are deploying the same types of models that Crisp have done now, which is very much a consultation-based approach to find out what is important to the brand. It's not, here's some tools, pick some keywords. It's picking some topics and some priorities. And then to use our skill set to configure the service appropriately to do that, whether that's 3 o'clock in the morning because it's a really urgent message, or whether that's onboarding a new customer at scale. But that critical bit is that consultation where those, what we call our risk consultants, but they know industry sectors and what we've seen inside out, or at least that's their goal, their customer success. And so that bit is the most critical bit for us. But then, of course, making sure that tools and people are trained appropriately is an entire other side of that most brands we partner with, they don't want to do themselves. And they don't generally have the resource to do that themselves either. So the understanding bit is the critical bit. What's important and what isn't, and what do we do when this happens?
Yeah, and I would just add, I guess, nothing that's really, truly valuable can be completely off the shelf with most things. And I think that investing the time in ensuring that our CRISP team understands our business and has context to help us more has been a really important part of this.
So I have a question here. It came to me privately, so I'm not going to mention who it came from, but it's for Adam. Really looking to learn more about what CRISP does specifically. Can you talk about kind of the strengths of the approach that you're taking, and kind of what the technology looks like that this runs upon? And if you would, where are the natural limitations of this, if there are any?
Sure. So I guess our big differentiator, if you look at that, the closest category to where we'd sit would be social media listening. And if you think of social media listening, it goes out and collects data from a whole variety of sources, or collects content from a whole variety of sources. And then you run keywords, maybe some other sentiment or some trend analysis over that content, which is great, and it serves a purpose, but it generally won't get to issues before they've already bubbled up to the surface and they're mainstream, because it's looking across the board. The approach we've taken at CRISP is I would call people focused, whereby we know where to listen or who to listen to, and we know the impact of those individuals, and we know where those individuals are online and in their public places. Of course, we're not doing anything that isn't public. But the content and the digital chatter that's spoken by those people we've got some more context on it, because we may know that someone is a follower or a supporter of QAnon. We may know that someone is very forward-looking, let's say, in the activist world for certain issues that are there. So we try and create a much bigger picture, and we call it a lens-based approach. So who said it? Who's that person interested in? Who are they connected to? What are their beliefs? What do we think their intent is? So a great example is a single security threat. There are countless numbers of security threats daily online. And if you were to grab a tool and just put in a brand and some kind of threat-based keywords, you're going to find an awful lot. The vast majority, there is no intent there whatsoever. It's just troll. So when we look at that, we will look at the person that said it, who they're connected to, what capability we think they have. So we're going to the person behind the content, and then wider than that, the groups they're associated with. So that can give us, when we look at really specific activist groups, for instance, we can really narrow down to find the latest trends within those groups. And it might be that they're going to target a brand next. So if we know that a few QAnon, for instance, members are discussing a certain brand, then it might only be 3 or 4 mentions, individual piece of content, but that's significant in the grand scheme of things. We also then try to understand who they influence in turn, and what that could look like from a bigger picture perspective. So that's where I'd really say our difference is in the technology stack we've built, is we're going from just content to understanding the people behind the content and the people's behavior, the groups they're a part of, what they've previously done, and the overall trends within that. And that provides a lot of different ways that we can look at it. And depending on who we're speaking to and the customer and their concerns will depend on how we look at it at any one time. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense.
I think it does. Actually, it kind of prompts me to ask Katie. So clearly you and CRISP are working together to identify and respond in appropriate ways to these risks. I understand that getting into specifics can be sensitive, but I'm wondering if you can share an example maybe of an instance where this early warning detection happened and you were able to muster a response.
Sure. One in particular actually springs to mind. On Twitter, there were some pretty serious suggestions, allegations around a very, very senior member of our team. And, they had the potential to really actually become a crisis if they gained traction. And together with CRISP, we were able to pretty quickly identify. And by the way, they started a number of handles started kicking off almost simultaneously. And together with Chris, we were able to identify that this was a network of bots. And within, under an hour, all of the bots, they were all removed from Twitter. And the speed with which we were able to respond to that was absolutely critical. Not to sort of, I think there are enough conspiracy theories going on in the world right now, but so not to sort of feed into it, but I think an interesting correlation here was we noticed that short trading of our stock was happening simultaneously. And so I don't know exactly what to make of that, but it was suspicious. And, that's the kind of thing that when you can squash that quickly, it just saves a lot of time, energy, anxiety.
So actually, just a follow up, and maybe this is for Adam. So you were able to identify and react really quickly, and the action that was taken was to remove these handles from Twitter. How would one go about doing that? Does Twitter have kind of an open area where you can submit these and they respond within hours, or?
So that's a really interesting, probably we could spend a whole hour talking about that, what we do. I mean, so if we separate down, there is owned, what we call owned channels. That's something the brand owns. So that could be a Facebook page, and the brand owns the content on there in the sense that they can choose to remove it and moderate it. So that's one action and that can be taken. With something like Twitter, yes, it's your handle. Yes, you receive the content. You can now hide content, but when someone's talking about you or making accusations, the only real option is to report it. And we have a mix between the partners for us, where some of them report it themselves and other times we report on behalf of the partner. I think the real interesting thing is we won't go into the specifics, but Twitter doing quite a good job at identifying bots and removing them from their platform. But sometimes they've already done the harm that they were intended to do before they're off platform. The critical bit was understanding that this wasn't individuals necessarily making an accusation. It's knowing that it's bots it's coming back to that people point. Is this real people? And we're looking at a whole variety of issues now online, which is who's saying it? Does it matter? Does that perception versus reality, as we were talking about? And that's what the goal was there, trying to work out and identify who's behind it. And when it's a bot network, it changes things dramatically. I would just add, Adam,
I think what was helpful in this instance was actually being able to, so there's a way, there's a mechanism to report what you believe is to be either false or a bot through the Twitter platform itself. And any company who has a Twitter handle has a Twitter rep and all of that. But we were able to actually kind of do the homework for them, which helped to make it more expeditious in terms of taking it down. We identified that this looks like a bot network because which meant that they could sort of we helped them to recognize that more quickly. It also pays to know the head of to have worked with the head of communications at Twitter. I don't know if he's a member.
He's a page member.
Brandon, so he would be great, a great speaker on this as well.
And I think it's a great point that, and on that side, that brands are often the best position to have those relationships with the platforms, but giving them a package that really expedites it through so it's easy and there isn't another investigation going on is that where we sort of sit in that, sit there. But you're right, Katie, it's all about who you know in that space sometimes from a speed perspective.
Andrea, if I can turn back to you for a moment. So we talked about kind of how boards are engaged on this. As I'm hearing these conversations, I'm thinking there's kind of an intra-organization coordination that needs to happen, cross-functional engagement on these types of issues. Are there is there advice that you give on what sorts of structures or practices are useful in this context?
Sure. I mean, everything depends on the organization. If it's early stage development, if it's mid-stage, mature, highly developed, a company like Katie's is a highly developed company that's been around for a long time and has a lot of the bells and whistles that you would want to have in an organization. But I think it's very important to pay attention to these issues and then create some what I would like to call agile structures around it. You don't want to create bureaucracy. To me, that's like anathema to dealing with these issues. So I'll give you an example of one of the companies I work for where I was heading up multiple functions, including risk, information security, audit, and ethics. Kind of a mishmash, but it made sense for that particular company, which is just under $1 billion in revenue, was fast growing, very complex global footprint. And there we created a multifunctional team of the relevant people that we needed to do issue spotting, risk management, and then also be available for crisis management. So it was a sort of a loose group of 14 people who, not everybody, but mostly would meet every 6 or 8 weeks. And we would revolve our discussions around the results of the enterprise risk management survey that we did every year. And of course, that's backward looking. And it's really important to have the tools that we're talking about here, which is not just backward looking, but today and maybe even early warning, looking around the corners. So you have to equip that group with those kinds of tools and insights. And what we did is we looked at our top, most likely, most damaging kinds of risks, and we would put small teams on them to go and solve the issue. And so we were then ready for the crisis when the crisis happened. And we were able to also create reporting up to the board and to the C-suite so that they knew. And so that was adapted to that particular profile of company. And I think every company has to think a little bit differently. And PR and comms is a really important part of that ecosystem, because if you aren't aware of these things and you're suddenly having to deal with a crisis on the outside with the stakeholders and you don't know what's happened underneath, you're not going to be able to represent, to a point that Katie made at the very beginning. You want the reality and what you're saying to match, the audio and the video to match. You don't want to be out there flailing in the wind, dealing with a crisis, not really knowing what your peers or your teams have been doing. So that's kind of in a nutshell, I think, where people need to go. They have to have something, but it has to be adapted.
Andrea, I'm flattered that you think we're so advanced, but just in the spirit of transparency, because I know there's some members of my team who are on here. 2-3 years ago, we didn't even have a corporate website. We sort of built this from scratch, really. So it's been, we're advanced in many areas, certainly our brand proposition and what we stand for and all of that. And that's of huge benefit to us in doing this type of work, but we've had to build it from scratch, basically.
Well, and that's how it's done, Katie, because, every company I worked in, and some were really big and some were smaller. I was the person who ended up saying, oh, we need this, we need that. And sometimes I had the great CEO who really listened, and sometimes I didn't. And I think there have to be curious and sort of proactive people like you and like me within our organizations who say, we need to get these things in place. We need to think about these because they will affect the brand. They will affect, the crisis response and so on and so forth. And so I think we're now in that turbocharged period through this 2020 perfect storm of risks that says, oh, yeah, we better have this in place going forward and not just forget about it, because there's a lot of lessons learned and improvements that can occur as you do these things.
Thank you, Andrea. Super helpful. I've got a couple of questions coming in the chat, so I want to turn to those. Please, everyone, feel free to add them there or just signal to me that you'd like to speak. Even if you have a comment and not a question, we'd love to get your perspective. This question is from Robert Gemel. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It seems like a question for Adam, probably one he gets pretty frequently. Where do you see CommTech predictive analysis heading in the coming years? Is AI becoming even better at identifying trends? Are there new emerging technologies, and what's the next thing on your radar? I feel like we're already in science fiction territory, but where do you see it going in the future?
So the answer is around predictive intelligence or analytics. We would probably use the word predictive intelligence is absolutely. Our next evolution of our technology is based on essentially what, if people are aware of graph technology, but how all the social networks are built, which is connecting all the dots that led up to an issue. Now, in coming back to how I started the conversation, you need a human to connect the dots. Now, And that's the bit where we come in. So utilizing human intelligence to connect the dots between which people are part of which groups, which have which beliefs, which were related to which issue. When you do that at scale, then you can absolutely use machine learning to be able to predict future issues based on what's happened in the past, because it knows that every time it sees a piece of content that shares this types of sentiment from this type of people and is growing at this rate, that we've always had a priority 1 or priority 2, you can start to train that. So to answer the question is, we are working on predictive analytics and predictive intelligence at the moment, but the critical bit there is making sure that humans have labeled and connected things correctly, because it's just not going to learn from a random data set that you give it. So yes, it is about to power the next generation of CommTech, if you were to put it that way, but communications intelligence we're about 6 months away from all of our solutions being powered by predictive analytics stroke intelligence. But humans still critical. It will get it wrong. It's just there. And actually, when you look at predictive analytics, that sometimes can see things that humans can't, but it still needs to bubble that up to a human to see what it's seeing, to see if that, our partners care about that. Again, so human touch points, AI at scale, machine learning is doing a lot. We use machine learning a ton at the moment to learn from what we see and learn that we don't need to see any more of this, or we need to see more of this. And the next side is that predictive graph technology that will power this.
A number of years ago, I heard somebody describe something called the turkey problem, which if you haven't heard, it's the idea that every morning a turkey wakes up and it gets fed and everything is fine. And based on its past history, it has no reason to believe that tomorrow won't be the same. But there's a Thursday in November every year where that day is very different for that turkey. And so I'm wondering, Adam, just along those lines, the technology is built on humans designing algorithms and taxonomies that try to collect that information. How dependent is that on our understanding of what's happened so far? And is that a limitation on how predictive the systems can be? Or does machine learning actually allow us to go beyond the past and scenario plan out things that haven't happened before?
Well, I'll separate them out into probably 3 distinct buckets. One is machine learning is brilliant at recognizing the same thing over and over again. And that's really utilized for trends analysis. And we may want to baseline it, or we may want to know if a particular group of people, again, all anonymized, but if that starts to be discussed, a particular issue, piece of content, conversation, chatter starts to be discussed by groups that really change that narrative or are having a much wider influence, or, it might be a specific demographic or just an activist group or whatever. So I think machine learning is great for that. It's also really good at learning previously if you've connected the dots correctly. And a human said, this is a priority 1 and it's linked to this type of issue. Machine learning is really good if you've got enough a data set there. And again, this is where you need a human team constantly building on the data set, because it changes daily, of going back and finding other things that could also be a problem going forwards. But one of the other things where it applies is anomaly detection, finding things that it doesn't know what it is. And at that point, by the way, it has no idea what it is. It doesn't know whether it's a new trend that's really cool or whether it's a new massive issue that's been targeted at organizations. And again, that's when it can originate those and bubble up all of those issues. That's again, when you use a human to say, don't worry about it. It's nothing anyone needs to worry about. It'll go into a report. People are going to love it. It's a great trend that we may do some advertising against. And that's not where CRISP sits. Or it might be, actually, this is a real serious issue that we could never have foresaw, and we need to let people know about it. So it has a job to play in all 3 of them. I can't say it more of not that the human labeling of data and the context and it knowing what it needs to spot, it finding things that it's never seen before, integrating the 2 and doing that at scale and quickly is the hard part. And of course, there is a lot of code that goes into AI and ML. It's not just an off-the-shelf thing that you buy and hope it works on a data set. Not yet.
Adam, I have a question here from Liz Lieberman. Do you have an industry standard or a rule of thumb around how many followers an individual should have to be considered truly influential? Are there examples where somebody has only a small following but is still considered influential in a particular network?
Yeah, I'd probably say we don't necessarily look at number of followers. It is one thing we're more concerned with. So the example I gave earlier, if they're a member of a very niche activist group, that's concerning that they are doing that because they're influencing that particular audience and that particular group. So when we talk about influencer, it's less about your marketing influencers. You know, the celebrities are a particular type of influencers. We would try and understand what type of audience is celebrity influencers and then how that might affect a brand. And of course, the number of followers is your amplification. That's just gauging the size then. If they're influencing a certain demographic, how big is that demographic that they're influencing and how much does that care? But sometimes it very much depends on the beliefs, the intent around that person, just as in the real world. If that, again, it's a good example as a security threat. If they've made tons of threats to people before and they're doing it and it looks like they're equipped in profile pictures and they're linked into groups and they're publicly promoting groups and threats, and then they make a threat, that's very different to a random troll who's never done that before saying something. And security is only one part of that, but hopefully that would make sense across the different types of influencers you've got. Real tiny where they have no influence, but actually essentially who they're being influenced by and the content they're taking gives us a lot of intelligence, to some small groups, to mainstream celebrities that influence particular demographics. You'd have to take all of those have a different impact.
Thank you, Adam. That's helpful. Let me pause here. We've got about 5 minutes left. I have a closing question for the panelists, but instead of me asking that, is there anyone who'd like to ask a question or make a comment here?
Hey, Elliot. As someone who's written binders of crisis plans for decades.
I have. I've done it.
Okay, but surely you have adapted the old three-ring binder that sat on somebody's shelf into other formats that ensure your team and everybody else has procedures, protocols, advice, and so forth that they can turn to when the risk has evolved into a crisis and you got to start doing something.
Absolutely. And I think the most important, just to get really practical about it, first point being the most important thing for us, again, is do you have the right people in the room having the conversation and are sort of sensitized to issues? One of the things that we started implementing at Ralph Lauren is on a quarterly basis, sometimes more than once a quarter, we will take a look at our risk register. So this is a cross-functional team with the head of our audit team, my CEO, legal, IR, my team, I'm the representative there, HR, and finance. And we pick an issue off of the risk register, and we actually sit in a room, sometimes with a facilitator, sometimes not. Sometimes we'll sort of self-direct it. And we go through a scenario, and we have sort of an open-ended conversation about what that looks like, what that feels like, and actually building that muscle so that you're not paralyzed when it actually arises is, I think, the most important thing that you can do. None of us could have predicted what happened this year. But having built trust with that group. So we kicked this off probably about 2 years ago. And so it's one of those meetings that are always like, do we really need this? Do we have to have this quarter? And I am adamant every quarter, we've got to have the meeting. Because it's one of those things that you're like, well, there's nothing currently brewing. And then every time we have the meeting, we're like, okay, that was good. Like, we're happy we did that. So I don't know, Rich, if that answers your question, but I don't want to disparage the process of risk preparedness or preparation whatsoever. I spent the vast majority of my career on the agency side. This is actually my first in-house role, and I have created many a binder. And I think for me, the point is that actual simulation and the trust that you build with a cross-functional team is invaluable, much more valuable than the specific response to the specific scenario in that document somewhere.
Yeah, well, I think your meetings are brilliant, and I hope you keep doing that. But my recommendation is that you turn the binder into something that people are carrying around in their phone, So they see the steps, they see the lists, they see some of that stuff that you just don't want to have to stop and create in the middle of a crisis. It's done. It might not be in the binder that you can't find, or it's back in your office where you haven't been for 9 months, but you still have all the planning and the thinking and some of those steps that you're carrying around with you every day.
Absolutely. And actually the process of creating those documents can be helpful unto itself. Just actually going through the process of thinking about the issues, even if you don't actually use them, use the materials, that process sensitizes you to, well, what are the issues? What should we be concerned about?
Yeah, exactly.
And just to add to that, we feel that's a real big part of the learning curve for a provider like ourselves, going through and understanding what the issues are and documenting them. But then the thing for us is understand we can't be an early warning service if we don't know who to warn about what issue, and not everyone needs to know about everything. So actually there's quite a lot of technology behind the scenes that knows if it's this type of issue, or now we are truly global, this type of issue in this part of the world, who needs to know about it? What priority is it? So we try and do a lot of that now for us to understand and replicate and build that into some solid processes that are there. Because for us, if we're not letting the right people know about it, our service may not be an early warning if it's sat in an inbox somewhere where no one's going to see.
If I could just jump in to embellish on both of your points, or all three of your points, I think it's really important to have that core team identified that is going to deal with that bigger crisis, not the little tiny crises, but then alternative people to that, as well as internal and external providers. So for the cyber example, you want to be able to hit the ground running, for example, but have those people identified. So it goes back to having the people trained, identified, and ready, rather than a ton of checklists, which are very good for the purposes that you just said, Katie, which is training yourself to think this way.
Yeah, and I would add, we're a controlled company, so it's not as applicable for us, but based on my past experience, shareholder activism, certainly a very critical topic to do some thinking, preparation, and certainly give thought to external advisors on.
Such great advice. This conversation is great. I wish it could continue, but I'm afraid we're at time. I'd like to thank Adam and the CRISP team for helping us to get this Page Patrons webinar together and for your support of Page. And thanks as well to Katie and for Andrea for sharing your experience and your expertise with the group here. If anyone's interested in learning more about CRISP, you can find out more at crispthinking.com. With that, I want to thank everybody for being here and hope you have a wonderful day.